Sinful influences. We must not allow worldly and sinful people to impact our attitudes and actions in unspiritual ways. Here's Gene to explain.
And we read, contemptible people among them had a strong craving for other food. Now let me say, most Bible expositors believe that the contemptible people, the ones that really started this negative attitude that is going to be described, were Egyptians who came out of Egypt with the children of Israel. And we know that there were strangers among them, they're called. And so they were Egyptians. But very quickly, this negative influence among the children of Israel spread over to the children of Israel themselves. And we see this in the next sentence. The Israelites cried again and said, and notice their questions, who will feed us meat? We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt. You know, isn't it amazing how quickly they forgot what it was to be under these slave masters? How quickly they forgot all of the challenges and the painful experiences in the mud pits making those bricks. And the only thing they could remember was when they came out of those situations, at least they had food. And it must have been good food. And they talk about that. We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt, along with the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. In essence, we're bored with what's going on here. There's nothing to look at but this manna. Day after day, God was providing the manna, the sweet manna, and they got tired of it. They did not like that particular diet. And so very quickly, the contemptible people complaining spilled over into the children of Israel's lives, and they began to complain as well. And so there's something about that experience, I think, that all of us can identify with. How quickly we can get bored with what we have, and how quickly we can forget what it's like not to have those things. We want to go back to those things, and in spite of some of the other problems, our fleshly appetites take over. And that's exactly what's happening here in this situation. You know, in the New Testament, Paul talks about being cautious of people that we live among that do not have the same values that we have. And here he's dealing with particularly immorality. And the Corinthians, of course, were in a society that was permeated with immorality, idolatry, prostitution, and then they came to Christ. And so Paul had to write to them and warn them. As Christians, he says, but now I'm writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother who is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, or reviler, a drunkard, a swindler. Do not even eat with such a person. Now, he's not saying that we should not be in association with. What he's saying is we should not fellowship with. We should not be participating in intimate fellowship with these people, because it will happen. The influence of their sin and their sinful behavior will begin to impact us. And so he's saying, you've got to be careful of your associations, because the negative people, those people who are out of harmony with the will of God, can influence those of us who want to walk in the will of God. And so this is a persistent concept from Genesis to Revelation, and something we need to apply in our own lives. He's not saying to remove ourselves from these people totally, because otherwise, Paul said, how can you even live? That's why you're here, to be salt and to be light. But the point here is fellowshipping with people whose values are contrary to our values, in a way, fellowshipping in a way that is going to affect the way we live. So Paul is warning us here and emphasizing this same principle. He's underscoring the importance of avoiding sinful influence. So the principle reads, we must not allow worldly and sinful people to impact our attitudes, our actions in unspiritual ways. And that takes us now to a very significant question. to think about. Why is it often easier for Christians generally to be influenced in negative ways by worldly people rather than worldly people to be influenced positively by those who are living in God's will? I'm sure you've seen that happens. There's a principle from 1 John that helps us understand that. Overcoming the world. And the principle reads, we must be on guard. On guard. We've got to be cautious. That's what God is saying. We must be on guard against worldly influences that interfere with our love for God and for one another. And that principle is based on a powerful statement by John when he wrote this little epistle towards the end of his life. When he wrote, do not love the world or the things that belong to the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in him, because everything that belongs to the world, and here is a very specific definition of worldly influence that is inappropriate. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride in one's lifestyle is not from the Father, but is from the world. And it's all around us. And then John says, and the world with its lust is passing away, but the one who does God's will remains forever. Now, in terms of the question, why is it true that it's easier for us to be influenced by the world rather than to influence the world towards the Lord? Well, there are several reasons for that. One is, we've seen in John, it's our human tendency to be worldly. It's our human tendency to gravitate because of our sin nature towards the things of the flesh that are inappropriate. The lust of the eyes towards things that are inappropriate. That's what it's talking about. The pride in one's life. That's the area where we're tempted. And it's interesting that if you look at the temptation of Jesus by Satan, when he was in the wilderness, Satan attacked him in those three areas. So it shouldn't surprise us that we will be attacked in those areas. That's part of our propensity because of our sin nature. The pleasures of sin are attractive. And when Moses made the decision to identify with his own people there in Egypt, where he was, in a sense, in the minds of the Pharaoh, where he was to be the next king of Egypt, they didn't realize that he was an Israelite because he had been raised by Pharaoh's daughter from the time that he was just taken from the Nile there in that basket where Pharaoh was going to kill all the boy babies. And they raised him, and he rode, the royal barges down the Nile River. And Josephus said that when Moses walked by, he was of such stature that people would literally turn and look as he walked by because they were enamored with how wonderful he looked. He had the reflections of being a specimen as far as a human being. Remember, when he was born, immediately the scripture says that he was beautiful. He was a beautiful child. And so, he walked with his shoulders back and his head held high, and he was proud and he was arrogant until God began to work in his heart and he began to move among his own people. And in Hebrews it says he chose at one point in life to be identified with slavery, his own people, rather than the pleasures of sin for a season. He had access to all the pleasures of Egypt, but it was a tough decision for him. And it's a tough decision for us because of Satan's influence in our lives. The wide road is a lot more convenient than the narrow road. It's easier to walk through that wide gate than it is to walk through that narrow gate. That's just the way we are in terms of our sin nature. The narrow road may call for sacrifice, and it usually does. That narrow road may involve persecution, and that's not a fun road to walk. And yet God says, enter through the narrow gate. Yes, the will of God is what? Acceptable? Absolutely. Perfect? Absolutely. Good? Absolutely. But often difficult. It's difficult. And so we must be on guard, you see, against this particular situation in our lives. So, Principle 14, sinful influences. We must not allow worldly and sinful people to impact our attitudes and actions in unspiritual ways. That's something we have to be on guard against, and it shouldn't surprise us. And it's illustrated in a rather dramatic way here among the children of Israel, because they were influenced in negative ways by people that did not have the values that God wanted them to have as a result of revealing the commandments from Mount Sinai.